Good evening. I'm Matt Fields, Special Assistant within the Office of the Archivist, and thank you for coming. You picked a good night to do so, as tonight we'll discuss American Covenant, How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again by Yuval Levin. In 1787, 1 month into that summer's long debate over the draft constitutional text, James Madison stated, "The government we mean to erect is intended to last for ages." In 1795, just a month after the acrimonious debate and ratification of the Jay Treaty, President Washington told some fellow citizens that the Constitution is the guide which I never will abandon. 65 years later, as he prepared for his first inaugural address, President-elect Lincoln, drawing from a proverb about words fitly spoken, compared the Constitution to a beautiful frame of silver, preserving our indispensable apple of gold, the Declaration. And in 1866, one of the most eloquent and impassioned drafters of the 14th Amendment titled his famous House floor speech, "One Country, One Constitution, One People." Our leaders and we Americans have always appealed to our Constitution for unity, for inspiration, and for guidance. Why is that so? Should we now? And if we do, what can we hope to find? Tonight's guest will help answer these questions. Yuval Levin is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. The founder and editor of National Affairs, he is also a senior editor at The New Atlantis, a contributing editor at National Review, and a contributing opinion writer at The New York Times. Dr. Levin has served on the White House domestic policy staff, been a congressional staffer at the highest levels, and is the author of numerous works on political philosophy and public policy. He will be interviewed tonight by the 11th Archivist of the United States, Dr. Colleen Shogan. Sworn in May 2023, Dr. Shogan is the first woman appointed to lead the National Archives. As the nation's record keeper, Dr. Shogan is responsible for preserving, protecting, and sharing the history of the United States. A noted author and political scientist, Dr. Shogan has made it a top priority to expand the reach of the National Archives to a wider audience. It's an exciting time here at the Archives. Our digital transformation continues. Last year, this very building was declared a National Historic Landmark, and we were featured on 60 Minutes. This fall, we'll open our new Signature Galleries exhibit space, and next January and March, we'll unveil both the Emancipation Proclamation and the 19th Amendment in the Rotunda, where they will join the Constitution we'll discuss tonight. Not to mention all the exciting programming leading up to July 2026, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So please come back often. And please join me in welcoming Yuval Levin and Dr. Colleen Shogan.
Well, welcome to the National Archives. I mean, I can't think of a more appropriate place to talk about your book on the Constitution.
I had exactly the same thought. The idea of talking about it where it lives is pretty amazing, so thank you.
Absolutely right. And I just loved your book. It was like reading, going back and reading some of the essays and some of the things that I thought about in undergraduate and graduate school, tying in a lot of the history of political thought along with the thought of our founders and some of the world's leading historians and political scientists. So thanks for writing this book.
Thank you.
Well, I want to start out with a question. The reason, this is the book, so you can see it, but I also have a question from the very beginning of the book, literally the quote that you start the book out with, which is an interesting quote. It's from Federalist 10. Of course, it's James Madison. You say, "As long as the reason of man continues fallible, and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed." And I wanted to know why you started this book with that particular quote from Federalist 10. It's kind of, when you think about it, it's a little bit of a dismal quote.
Yes.
The fact that a whole science of government that Madison is trying to defend, if reason is fallible, then in some ways, what's the point?
Yeah.
So maybe tell us why you started with that quote.
Yeah, it's dismal in just the way that Madison can be wonderfully dismal sometimes, but it's also blunt in the way that Madison is. And ultimately, it begins from the fallibility of human reason, yes, but it stakes out as a premise the fact that in a free society, we will never all agree about everything. We will never all agree about anything. And the fact that we have the freedom to exercise our own reason means that unanimity is not an option, not if we're going to be free. I started a book about the Constitution and unity in that way because I think that there's an idea of unity implicit in the Constitution that begins from that premise, that says unity is not going to be unanimity. Unity is not going to look like everybody agreeing. Very often when our political leaders talk about unity, that's what they have in mind. They say, if everybody agreed with me, things would be really great. And every recent president has said, when Americans are united, there's nothing they can't do. What he really means is, shut up. Don't stand in my way. I get that, but Madison says, no, that's not going to happen. And so then what is unity in a free society if that's the case? This book starts out with a chapter called What is the Constitution? It ends with a chapter called What is Unity? And in a sense, the book is an attempt to answer both of those questions by way of one another. Because there is an idea of unity that's inherent in the Constitution. It says unity in a free society doesn't mean thinking alike. Unity means acting together. And politics is about collective action, not about collective thought. In a free society, the challenge is, how can we act together when we don't think alike? I think the American Constitution is a set of answers to that question. How can we act together when we don't think alike? And the nature of the answer that it offers over and over through its various institutions, through its modes of facilitating public action, is coalition building. It's negotiating, it's competing, it's building coalitions so that we find ways to each get something because we don't agree, and in the end to be able to act together to address common problems. And the Constitution, of a lot of what is most mysterious and frustrating about it, I think is a function of the fact that it is an answer to that question. So when we ask ourselves, why is this so complicated? Why can't I just get done what I want? I won the election, right? A question that every modern president has asked. The answer is that ultimately this system exists to allow us to act together when we don't think alike. And that's a very challenging thing to do. It's challenging to do that in a way that's perceived as legitimate by people in different factions of our society. And the way in which the Constitution makes us do it is by forcing us to deal with each other. And I think that's ultimately the magic of the system. And it begins from Madison's premise that we are going to disagree. Ending disagreement is not the purpose of politics. It isn't possible.
No. There's plenty of disagreement in politics, and there's plenty of disagreement today, but you argue in the book that there are some principles that we agree upon. So can you tell us what are those principles and where can we find them?
Yeah, I think Americans have a tendency to exaggerate how much we disagree. We do disagree, and this is a moment of division, a moment of real difference and polarization, but we do underestimate, Americans always have, how much we have in common. We think, if you're a conservative living in the South, you think about somebody in San Francisco and you think, I got nothing in common with that person. But I would say to you, spend a couple of weeks in a foreign country and run into an American, and you're going to tell from a mile away that that is an American, and you're going to have a lot to talk about, because there's a lot that Americans have in common. Some of it is cultural, some of it is history that creates a kind of shared identity that we can immediately identify when we find ourselves with other Americans. But some of it is also a set of principles. And the core of those are that other great document that lives in this building, the Declaration of Independence. Americans really do agree that we're all created equal. We disagree very often about what that means, what it should mean in our practical political life, what sense to make of it. But you don't find a lot of people in our society. There are some, and I think that it's important to point them out and see that they're wrong. You don't find a lot of people who will deny the claims of the Declaration of Independence. So that the disagreement between the 1619 project on the left and the 1776 project on the right is really about how do we live up to the ideals of the Declaration, not whether those are true. And very often, our debates in America are about how we live up to those. There have been debates about whether they're true. The Civil War was about that. That's not a small debate in American life. But fundamentally, Americans do agree that our politics has to begin from the reality of equal human dignity. That's why we have to respect each other's opinions. That's why we can't push each other around. It's why just getting a majority behind you is not enough for everything. And I do think that we shouldn't underestimate how important it is that our society begins from some shared premises that have real importance and then argues about what they mean. It keeps our politics within the 40-yard lines a lot of the time. Even our extremists are not as extremist as the ones you find in a lot of other democracies, because we really do begin from a set of premises that, argue as we do, we have in common.
Mm-hmm. So what's the relationship between the Declaration and the Constitution? How would you define that?
It's a very complicated question. We heard mention of Lincoln's wonderful use of the phrase from the Book of Proverbs about how the Constitution is the frame and the Declaration is the picture at its center. I think there's truth to that. There is a way in which the Constitution is a working out of some of the premises of the Declaration. But I would say a striking thing about the Declaration of Independence, when you look at it with this question in mind, is that it doesn't specify a form of government. The Declaration doesn't say that we have to have a democracy. It doesn't say that we can't have a king or that monarchy is illegitimate. There have been people who've read it that way. I would say some of the people who wrote it thought that way. But the Declaration actually says explicitly that the people can choose a form of government that they think will best serve their safety and happiness. And the Constitution is the answer we ended up offering to the question of what form of government is demanded by this framework that the Declaration offers, this set of principles. I think it is very much in line with those principles. It's not the only way that we could possibly apply those principles, but it is a way that recognizes the core truth, the truth of human equality that is distinct to the Declaration and that tries to turn that into an actual way of life. I think it does it wonderfully well, and it does begin from premises articulated in the Declaration, but it's ultimately about how, not just what, but how. How do we govern ourselves? What should the rules be? What should the framework be? Those are not the questions that occupied the Declaration.
I want to push you on one of the principles that we commonly associate when we talk about democracy. A lot of people think, democracy is about majority rule. It's 50% plus one, and then you have the ability to enact what you want.
Yeah.
You argue in the book that actually, majoritarianism, strict majoritarianism, can actually lead to have bad consequences. But I want to push you on that a little bit because there is, when I studied political theory and political thought, like some of the ways that you evaluate a principle is there a simplicity to that principle? Is there an efficiency to that principle?
Yeah.
And there certainly is both a simplicity and efficiency to the principle of majoritarianism or 50 plus 1 rules. So how do you defend saying that majoritarianism isn't always the principle that we want to abide by?
So I certainly agree that majority rule is ultimately a necessary principle of legitimacy in a democracy. There isn't any other way to think about how to use power. No kind of minority rule is a legitimate way to use public power. The trouble is that majority rule can also be very unjust. And you don't have to look too far in the history of democracies or in the history of the United States to see the ways in which, particularly if you have a durable majority and minority, majority rule empowers majorities to oppress minorities. That the argument for slavery before the Civil War was an argument for majority rule. It was simply an argument that said, let each state decide, let its majority reach the decision it'll reach, and that's the legitimate way. And the opponents had to say, no, there are times when majority rule doesn't make something true that isn't true. Now, there's not a simple way to figure out when those moments arise. And the Constitution's solution to this problem is to force majorities to grow before they are empowered, so that we don't allow narrow majorities to have all the power in our system. It's really important to see this is a way in which the American system differs from most other modern democracies. In the parliamentary systems, which are legitimate democratic systems, obviously, winning an election means you win all the power of the state until you lose your majority, until you lose your mandate in Parliament. In the American system, winning an election does not mean winning all the power of the state. Talk to any public official, and they will tell you that after you win an election, what happens is you find yourself in a room with other people who also won an election, and they disagree with you. And every modern president has found himself sitting in the Oval Office thinking, why am I still dealing with these people? I just won the election. And the answer the Constitution offers to that person is, before you really can get all the power here, you have to broaden this coalition. Get to a place where more people agree. It is still ultimately a matter of majority rule, but the Constitution empowers broad, durable majorities to take action. And it begins from the premise that, generally speaking, it is better to do nothing than to allow majorities to oppress minorities. And so there's a lot of doing nothing in the American system, and that's frustrating too. But the reason for it is that there is a danger in allowing narrow, ephemeral majorities to exercise all the power of government. And so the Constitution, by placing powers in one another's way, by dividing and separating the branches of government, by dividing the Congress into two houses, constantly requires majorities to grow before they can act. And the reason for doing that is this challenge of legitimacy, not simply democracy, but legitimate democracy, in which there has to be some way for even minorities to have a say, especially broad, durable, long-standing minorities can't be treated as if they don't matter at all in our system of government. And so, yeah, I think a lot of what frustrates us about the Constitution a lot of the time, this is especially true now, I should say. The 21st century in American political life has been distinguished by narrow majorities. We've had over and over these 50-50 elections where you win by a tiny margin, you have a little tiny margin in Congress, and a lot of what that means is you can't get much done. You have to work with the other party. When you win by a narrow margin and you say we're only going to do things in a partisan way, you're probably not going to get much done. And that is a feature, not a bug, of the American Constitution. It says when there aren't broad, durable majorities, when there are, they get their way. If a big majority of Americans want something, they're going to get it. But if a narrow and ephemeral, passing, fading majority wants something, they're going to have to deal with other people and build a coalition.
That leads us to really a big crux of the book, which you clearly emphasize that a lot of some of the challenges facing American democracy today lie in Congress, in the legislative branch, in Article 1.
Yes.
So talk to us about how you argue in the book that Congress really has the power to be, in some ways, the unifying institution of American government. But I guarantee you, if you asked, I would say, I don't know, well over 90%, maybe even 100% of Americans, yes. Is Congress a unifying institution in American government? I don't think many people would say yes.
Yes.
So how can Congress become a unifying institution? What are the problems? What's preventing it from being a unifying institution? Is it really the crux of the matter?
This is a great way to put the question. So I think that to begin with, the answer has to do with the nature of unity that I've been discussing, which is not unity in the form of agreement, of quiet conversations over dinner, but unity in the form of bargaining, negotiating, deal-making, hammering out differences. The place where that can happen at the national level in our system, the only place, is Congress. Congress is the representative institution in our system. The president is elected, but the framers don't talk about the president as representative. The president is elected in order to be accountable, but the president is one person, and this is a large society, and a large, diverse, complicated society. To represent that society requires a plural institution, an institution that contains in itself some of the key differences and divisions that are evident in the American public at large. And what Congress is for allowing the representatives of those distinct factions of American society to deal with each other, to negotiate with each other, to bargain, to compromise, to find ways to arrive at legislative arrangements that can then reflect back on the public and allow for some greater unity in society. What that means, though, is that Congress has to see its work as negotiation. I think, as you say, just about everybody agrees now that Congress isn't working well. The 21st century Congress is not working well. There are very few people who would disagree with that, and if you ask people if they approve of Congress, the numbers are in the low single digits now. And honestly, you have to wonder if those people heard the question properly.
Well, John McCain always said it was staff and relatives.
That's right.
That's what he would always say, staff
I believe
and relatives.
But the question is, so there's broad agreement that Congress isn't working, but what is Congress not doing? I think that is actually a very contentious question. Even in the little community of congressional reformers in Washington that I'm part of, that question is not agreed on. The natural answer, the intuitive answer, what is Congress not doing? Congress is not passing the big legislation that we need to address whatever you think is the biggest problem, the fiscal problems, environment, immigration. It's not passing those big bills. I think that I would say I'm in a minority of the congressional reform world that thinks that the problem is actually that Congress is not facilitating cross-partisan bargaining. Now, that's also why it's not passing big bills. But the problem of a failure to facilitate bargaining is prior to the problem of not passing big bills. The job of Congress is to allow for deal-making across party lines. The diagnosis really matters, because if you think the problem is not passing big bills, then you want Congress to be more efficient. And so you want to get rid of all the things that stand in the way of efficient action. You hate the filibuster. You want more centralized power and leadership so that they can just get the discipline among their party to just pass the damn bill. And a lot of times when your party is in the majority in Congress, that's what frustrates you, is you just can't get it together and get it done. If you think that the problem is Congress is not facilitating cross-partisan bargaining, then you want Congress to be less efficient. You love the filibuster, as I love the filibuster. It's the only reason why we have any bipartisan legislation in the 21st century Congress. And you don't want to centralize power and leadership. You want to disperse power in the committees, where there is actually an opportunity to bargain across lines of difference. And you want to see more broadening of coalitions. So, for example, we're at the beginning of a new presidential term now, and the majority party, so this president, like every president for 30 years, since 1992 with Bill Clinton, has come in with his party controlling both houses of Congress, barely. Every president has been in that situation. And the last several presidents, I will say this, I used to work for President Bush. When he came in, George W. Bush, when he came in 2001, his party controlled both houses very narrowly. And the assumption was, we got to find Democrats. We got to find Democrats for our education bill, for our Medicare reforms. We have to find those 20, 30 Democrats who might break with their party and vote with me, because we're going to lose 15, 20 Republicans. That is no longer the assumption that presidents of either party make. Republicans now are coming in, and their question is, how many reconciliation bills do we pass where we don't need a single Democratic vote to pass this bill? That is the wrong way to think about how Congress should work. I think President Trump could easily get 25, 30 Democrats to vote for a tax bill that he could also like, but they're not even trying to do that. And Congress doesn't try to do that enough either. They do it when they have to, and they have to mostly when the filibuster will not let them do otherwise. But most of the time, members don't think their job is to reach across party lines and make deals. Republicans fired the Speaker last year because he passed a budget with Democratic votes. That is his job. That is the job description of the Speaker. And so I think when we've reached a point where members don't see it as their job to build cross-partisan coalitions, Congress doesn't work well to facilitate the kind of work that it exists to do. And along the way, in building those coalitions, it also can help build broader unity. So to my mind, the answer to how can Congress work better to achieve its fundamental purpose when it comes to thinking about constitutional work, to build the unity you can build by broadening coalitions, I think we have to think about reforms of the budget process, of the committee system, of the relationship between leadership and membership, and the book talks about some specific ideas on that front, to give members a reason to invest themselves in bargaining across party lines. They don't have enough of a reason now, and they have very strong reasons not to do it. They're always dealing with primary voters who are the people in our country who least want to see cross-partisan bargaining. They're the most powerful part of the electorate, and so the incentives have to change. That's a Madisonian insight. Incentives matter. Ambitious men and women will do what it takes to succeed. The question is, what is success? Is success building a big social media following if you're a member of Congress? Apparently it is, and these ambitious men and women are very good at it. But what if success looked like advancing legislation? How can we create the incentives that could help that happen? I think that's the question that reformers have to be thinking about now.
Well, that leads us right into the presidency, because in your chapter on the presidency, you talk about this construction of the rhetorical presidency, which also seeks to fill a vacuum of leadership. So could you tell us what is the rhetorical presidency and why is it problematic for executive leadership?
Yeah, this term, the rhetorical presidency, I think it was coined by Jeffrey Toulis, a wonderful political scientist. It's one of these things where every political scientist thinks, how could I not have thought of that term before? Damn it. It was a title of a book that Toulis wrote in 1987. And it's intended as a description of the nature of the evolution of the presidency, particularly in the 20th century, beginning really in the late 19th century, where Americans came to think of the president as embodying the nation. There's some idea of this, I should say. There's some talk like this at the Constitutional Convention. James Wilson from Pennsylvania particularly had this notion of the president. But it was definitely not how most people understood the office until really the beginning of the Progressive Era. And even from there, that idea of what the presidency is grew and grew through the 20th century and into the 21st, so that we think of the president as speaking for the country, and in a sense as embodying whatever unity there is in our society. But more than that, and Toulis really shows this well, because we think of the president as speaking for the country, we think of the job of the president as speaking. And the job of the president is actually administration. Administration is this very complicated notion that we've entirely lost sight of now. I don't think it's possible really to define that term in modern American politics. The job of administration involves facilitating public action. The president acts in light of laws passed by the Congress, and ultimately the core of the job is the faithful execution of the law. But the presidency was intentionally created in this ambiguous space where it's not entirely clear how assertive the president is allowed to be. That mystery that's confronted every president is intentional. It was set there by the framers so that we could benefit both from a presidency that is there to execute the law, and from a presidency that enjoys the energy of an effective executive who responds to challenges and exigencies on behalf of the country. The president's job is action, not talk. The presidency exists in the present tense. So you might think of the Congress as existing in a future tense. The Congress builds for the future. It frames out laws that become relevant after they are passed and sort of frame government action. The courts operate in the past tense. They review action that's already happened and they decide if it was in line with the law. The president lives in the present tense. Things happen in the world and the president gets woken up at 3 a.m, and the question is, what are we supposed to do? That's a particular kind of challenge that requires a particular kind of individual, a person capable of prudential judgment, of applying the law to particular instances, which the law cannot envision every instance in advance, of thinking on his feet, of making decisions about how to deploy the vast authority of the American government. That job is not about talking. Talking matters, right? And presidents have always mattered rhetorically, especially in times of crisis, in times of war. You know, we do remember presidents for what they say. There is something extraordinary about Abraham Lincoln's rhetoric. But Abraham Lincoln's rhetoric existed in the service of Abraham Lincoln's leadership, of action. It was not just talk. And the ability to really act prudentially in that way is, I think, what really distinguishes a lot of our most significant presidents. Modern presidents mistake talk for action, right? And so the federal courts in the last few years have had to deal with the question, is a tweet a policy? Is that a decision that has actual effect? Both President Trump and President Biden put this question before the courts because they just kind of make announcements. And then the question is, well, I work in the department of whatever. Am I supposed to act on this? Is this administration? The rhetorical presidency has gotten to the point where we now equate presidential talk with presidential action to a degree that understates the importance of administration. The ability to administer effectively, which means really to think about the connection between resources and effects, between power, between cause and effect with power in the middle. How do we turn this massive administrative apparatus into action is a very complicated question that requires really thinking about public administration. And I don't think it's going too far on a limb to say that our contemporary presidents tend not to think enough about public administration. They'll just put stuff out and create enormous chaos. This is important to think about because it's important to think about because we live in this moment and, read the news, but also because the way in which chaos undermines presidential power is not thought about enough today. Alexander Hamilton thought about this question a lot. And to describe his thinking about it, he coins a phrase in the Federalist. He uses it a couple of times in Federalist 72 and 76. The phrase is steady administration. And for Hamilton, steady administration is really at the center of the president's role. Steadiness means you don't make sharp turns, you don't make sudden stops. When a new president comes in, there will be a change of direction, but it should happen in a gradual way that allows itself to be worked out so that people are not confused, so that people are not uncertain, because uncertainty makes it very, very hard for people to live in a free society. If you don't know what the law is going to be tomorrow, you don't know how to be a law-abiding citizen today. If you can't have the expectation of stability, then it's very hard to plan, it's very hard to invest, it's very hard to build, and society shuts down. And it's the president, above all, more than any other public official in our national government, who's charged with this task of assuring stability. I think our modern presidents have almost entirely forgotten that this is their job. Of both parties, of whatever views, it's just not how they think about what their role is. And it seems to me that becoming reacquainted with the Constitution is a way to remember that.
So last, the judiciary, which is in some ways the institution that we know, in some ways we have the least knowledge about as political scientists, and also some people have described it as the least democratic because of the composition of the judiciary. What role does the judiciary play in our constitutional structure?
Yeah, I think the basic role of the judiciary is to enforce the rules. What stands out about the American system for its having a written constitution, the United States was really the first democracy to have a written constitution. It's not the only one anymore, but to begin with, this idea of a written constitution was novel and strange. It was controversial. There are a lot of thinkers in English politics, including some who were very friendly to the American founding. Edmund Burke stands out in this way, who thought it was a terrible mistake to have a written constitution because it doesn't allow you the kind of flexibility that makes for evolution. Everything is strictly defined and codified, and it makes it very hard to move. But the value of a written constitution is that it separates policy from constitutionalism. There are debates we have about what direction our government should take on various policy questions. Those debates happen within a framework that is not part of those debates, that allows the debates to happen. And the role of the judiciary is to secure that framework. It's not to act as a political actor within that system, to make policy decisions. The judiciary is not elected. It's not accountable to the public. Judges are appointed once and they serve for life. That means they don't really settle the disputes we have about what our priorities should be, what direction public policy should take. It wouldn't be right in a democracy to have judges decide those questions. But the question of what does the law say and mean, and what does the Constitution say and mean, is, I think, best left to the judiciary. Their job is to secure the boundaries and make sure that the various actors in our system, whether that's presidents or Congress or the states, but also whether it's citizens, majorities, to make sure that they are acting within the bounds established for them to act in the system. That is a constrained view of the role of the judge. It's not a view that says the judge is here to advance social change, whatever you think of that change. It's not a view that says the judge is here to make sure that our politics take a certain direction. I think the appeal of judicial activism is very hard to resist. Whichever side of our politics has a majority on the Supreme Court is inclined to judicial activism. I see this in my own world. I'm on the right. Conservatives have argued against judicial activism for most of my lifetime, and then we got a majority on the court, and suddenly conservatives kind of like judicial activism. We could get things done this way. I think that's a terrible mistake, because when you allow judges to make public policy, you separate policymaking from our democratic institutions, and you undermine its legitimacy, both the legitimacy of the policy and of the courts. And so for that reason, I think that the constrained, narrow view of the judge's role is the right one. It's a very hard view of the judge's role for judges to really live with, but I think it's what we should demand of them.
You also have, towards the end of the book, you have a chapter, I mean, you've gone through all the branches of government. You also are talking about how to achieve unity. And interestingly enough, you say one of the problems with our inability to act in a unified way is the fact that we've forgotten how to disagree with each other. We disagree poorly with each other. Can you talk a little bit about that? And what would it look like to disagree better?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a way, of looking at contemporary American political life and say, we just disagree too much. But I don't think that's quite right. I think we actually don't disagree nearly enough. We've closed off all the spaces where constructive disagreement can happen. Above all, Congress, as I said, where that's what's supposed to happen in Congress, is disagreement that results ultimately in some arrangement, some accommodation. That's not enough of what happens in Congress now. Congress now becomes a place where the two parties talk about each other rather than talking to each other. And in general, American political life, even the most intensely engaged, politically engaged American citizens don't actually tend to spend very much time engaged with people they disagree with. They spend a lot of time with people they agree with, complaining about people they disagree with. And that's not the same thing. We haven't forgotten how to agree in America. We're very good at agreeing. We spend all our time agreeing with people we agree with. We've forgotten how to disagree. And learning how to disagree in a way that begins from the assumption that the people you disagree with aren't going away. They're still going to be here at the end of the disagreement, so that whatever happens in the next election, they're still going to be here. And whatever happens at the end of this debate, they're still going to be here and matter. And therefore, they have to be dealt with somehow. And when I say deal with each other, that's not a metaphor. You have to actually make deals with each other. You have to say this for that. You have to prioritize and say this matters most to me, that matters most to you. Let's find a way, and I'll give up something to get something. That's ultimately how democratic life in an unavoidably, permanently diverse society has to work. And I think the Constitution is built on that premise. There's a way in which we get frustrated with it because we feel like it's standing in our way. But it actually seems to me that it is offering us a way, that what we need is a reacquaintance with the Constitution, not a rejection of it. Because it says to us, I know you want to get rid of those damn people, but they're not going anywhere, and here's a way to live with them. That's the recipe we're missing, and I think a lot of it is in the Constitution. There's an argument for reform too. There are ways in which we have to think about how the system should change, but we have to see what it's for before we can think about how to fix it. And I think a lot of what we've forgotten when it comes to the American Constitution is what it's for. It is for facilitating unity in a divided society. That's not how we naturally think of it. I think that's very much what it is and what it still can be for us.
Then lastly, you are a naturalized citizen. You came to this country, you immigrated.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that story? And do you think that part of your life, that reality that you are a naturalized citizen, do you think that has affected your relationship and how you view the Constitution?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, in some ways, I'm sure it has. So I came to the United States as a child. I'm very American, but I was 8 years old. My family came here from Israel. I became an American citizen when I was 19, and I tell this story briefly in the book. I took the oath of naturalization at the federal courthouse in Newark, New Jersey, and this judge who gave us the oath, in my mind, he's this ancient, grizzled judge, but I was 19, so he was probably like 40, right? And he gave us the oath, and then he gets up to give a little talk. And I thought by then I was already very much an American. I was a political science college student, history buff. I thought he was going to talk about Lincoln and George Washington, and he didn't do any of that. He said something very strange to all of us. He said, from now on, you have to think and talk about America in the first person plural. And I did not know what he meant. I think a lot of people who were in that group of immigrants thought to themselves, I'm glad that wasn't on the test, because I don't know what you're talking about. And he told us what it meant was to talk about America not in terms of they and them, which is how immigrants naturally talk about America, but rather in terms of we and us. And to think and talk about this country as being our problem and our strength. I have to tell you honestly that I was disappointed with the speech on that day, but I've been talking about it ever since because that's exactly what Americans need to hear. Not just immigrants, but everybody. To think and talk about America in terms of we and us. It has a lot to do with the Constitution. We is the first word of the Constitution. It's not a coincidence. We is the first word of that amazing second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. Right? We hold these truths. That's not a coincidence either. Those are both documents that speak on behalf of a people who are taking common ownership of their fate together. They don't think of their country as us and them. They think of their country in terms of everyone, all of us. To say we and mean everybody is the great challenge in American life. It's very hard to do. To hear the word we and think that it means you too is also a great challenge in American life. We tend to hear politicians say we, and we think they mean their party, their people. But we have to find a way so that that word means to us, all of us, everyone here. I think the Constitution is there in large part for that purpose. And for me, that's very much in retrospect, I've spent my adult life since that day when that judge said that thing, basically trying to make sense of what it would mean to think and talk about America in that way. And clearly there's a lot of work to be done on that front in our country. But I think seeing that that's the challenge is a start.
Thank you very much. Do we have questions from the audience? I think we have a microphone that's going to be coming around so that our audience, so we'll start right here and then over here. So. Yes.
Good book. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
My question concerns federalism, Chapter 4, specifically cooperative federalism. You seem to indicate that states, in the original logic, could cooperate with one another or not. But federal and state action should be mostly kept separate.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about this a little bit, and I was thinking about the legislative bargaining that you mentioned and the Social Security Act, which will be 90 years old this year. Title II, which we call Social Security, is the old age program. That was a centralized federal program.
Mm-hmm.
But for example, Title III, the unemployment insurance program, is a federal state program, part of the cooperative federalism arrangement.
Yeah.
Now, Dick Nathan many years ago told me that federalism, in a word, is basically always changing. So, isn't cooperative federalism merely part of the long-changing nature of federalism, rather than, say, anti-constitutional?
Thank you. It's a great question. Well, certainly to begin with, yes. Cooperative federalism is an evolution of federalism, and it's been with us for a long time, and it's part of our tradition of federalism. The way that I approach the question is to think about federalism as one of the ways in which the Constitution tries to facilitate unity in a divided society, right? Greater unity. And seen from that angle, the promise of federalism is not that it layers our governments over each other, that you have a kind of national government at the top and then state and then local. That was not at all the logic of federalism to begin with, right? Federalism was a very peculiar compromise at the Constitutional Convention because you had some people come into the convention arguing that there should only be a national government that governs the people directly, and the states should just become administrative districts of the national government, like counties are in most states. This was Hamilton's view. It was Madison's view. There were other people who wanted the national government to be something like a confederation, like the UN. The states really govern. They govern the people. But they have some common concerns, and they send delegates to the national government to resolve those problems. And those people are mostly acting on behalf of the states. The tension between those two options was the central tension of the Constitutional Convention, and you see the resolution of it in the nature of the Congress, where they couldn't decide if members should represent states or the people. And the resolution, in a very characteristic of the way the convention solved big problems, was just to say, yes, we're going to do both things, even though they're totally contradictory and incoherent. It makes no sense to do them both, but we're going to do them both. This kind of logic is evident all over the system. I think it's a wonderful thing. But with respect to federalism, the solution was not to answer the question, should we have a national government that governs the people, or should the states govern the people? The solution was, again, to say, yes, we're going to have a national government that governs the people, and the states are going to govern the people. And the separation has to do with policy domains. The national government governs the people directly in some areas of life, especially when it comes to commerce and when it comes to national security, as we would call it now. The states govern in most of the other domains, and they both govern the people directly. the logic that allows for that compromise also allows for federalism to serve as a kind of release valve on American political life. You can answer really divisive public questions in different ways in different places. And there doesn't have to be one national answer, so we don't have to fight about it forever. You can just say, look, they do education differently in California and in Florida, really differently. And that's okay. The people who live in these places think that that's the right way to do it, and they're all Americans, and we can all do this at the same time. For that to work, there has to be a separation of policy domains. When you begin to combine them, as we've done, as you say, in some welfare programs, we've done a lot of it in healthcare. The Medicaid program is the perfect example of this. Medicaid is run by both the states and the federal government. It's funded mostly by the feds. It's administered mostly by the states. And when something goes wrong, the states blame the feds, and the feds blame the states, and nobody's in charge. The problem that creates is that you get the downsides of both state government and federal government without the upsides of either. There have to be national answers to these problems, right? Should Medicaid fund abortion? Is a question that I would love to be able to answer differently in different states. We're not able to do that because there has to be some national policy. Even now, in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision on abortion, Medicaid, because it's a national program and a state program, doesn't allow for this to happen. And yet it's run differently in different states, and states with less money have poorer Medicaid programs. So if we want to reform federalism to allow it to better facilitate national unity, if the problem we're trying to address is that we are very polarized and divided, I think we have to reform it in the direction of a clearer distinction between state and federal authorities. Rather than entwine them as we do in healthcare and welfare and education, we should separate them. And maybe healthcare should be a federal priority. That's a debate we should have. But should it be both a state and a federal priority at the same time? I don't think that's a good idea. And I do think cooperative federalism has mostly been a bad thing for American political culture. It has some economic advantages, but I think if we think about it from the point of view of the Constitution, it's something we should move away from.
There's a question right here.
My question is the comment that the judge made to you when you were being naturalized as a citizen troubles me to try and get my brain around it. My great-grandfather was brought here as a slave.
Yeah.
And so those wonderful documents, the Declaration and the Constitution, when they talk about we, didn't include my grandfather. We were considered 3/5 of a human being. We weren't considered human. And so it's really kind of disingenuous and hypocritical to talk about that in that sense. So give me some comments.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. I mean, this is obviously the most powerful challenge to the legitimacy of the American Constitution. But I think that if we see that what these documents allowed for is for us to spend the last 250 years trying to work in the direction of saying we and meaning everyone, then we benefit from the fact that those documents are there, that they stand there and say to us, all men are created equal. And I know the author of that sentence didn't mean it, but that sentence is still true. It is true. And because it's true, it makes demands on our society. It makes demands on those documents. And it forces us to say, what would it mean to really believe that this is true? Some of what it's meant has involved changes to the Constitution, very important post-Civil War amendments to the Constitution that said everyone has a right to vote, everyone has a right to the equal protection of the laws. And then we spent another 150 years actually trying to put those words into effect too. We're still trying to do that in a lot of ways. So I absolutely agree that we have to recognize that the people who said those words and wrote those things did not act as if they meant them in every respect, but we can act as if we mean them because we do mean them, because they are true. And I think the Constitution gives us the tools to move in that direction more and more and to live up to the demands and the promise of the Declaration of Independence more and more, and that it gives us those tools in a better way than the kinds of alternatives that I at least have seen proposed, the kinds of ways of changing the system. Because the core problem that the Constitution tries to address, the problem of how do we act together when we don't think alike while balancing majority rule and minority rights, is a problem that speaks exactly to the concern that you're pointing to, right? Because the people who wanted to deny rights to black Americans said, look, most of the people in Missouri want to do this. It's a majority vote. Put it up for a vote and we win. And there is a way in which a system that says a majority vote is not the only thing we have to think about here, that there are other ways, that there are some rights that are simply protected. They're written in these documents, and so they matter, and judges will insist on them. Even if 90% of the public wants to deny somebody their freedom of religion, the Supreme Court's not going to do that, I hope. And the fact that it's in that document means that it actually can survive even an attack from an American majority, I think is enormously important. And so, without in any way denying the point you raise, I do think that these documents offer us an enormous and constantly promising tool for addressing exactly the problem you point to, and for allowing the we that is the first word of that document to really mean all of us. That's a challenge we're always going to have to work at. It's not going to be done in our lifetimes. It may not be done in anybody's lifetime. But if in all of those years we understand our project in America to be defined by that goal, then we're likely to live in a better and better country. And I think in a fallen world, that's the most I can hope for.
Yeah. The greatest exposition of that would be the Lincoln-Douglas debates, right?
Yeah.
Because
right.
Douglas defending the right of popular sovereignty, as Yuval says, and Lincoln saying, actually, popular sovereignty isn't the principle that we have to think about. He actually starts to think about the moral principles contained in the Declaration. It's a defense of the Declaration.
Exactly.
And that dichotomy is really, if you want to read the Lincoln-Douglas debate.
He says if a majority says 1 + 1 is 3, that doesn't make it true.
Right.
Some things are just true. And all men are created equal is just true.
Yeah. Back here. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for the fascinating discussion. I want to kind of go back to your premise on the unity in a body that disagrees with itself and the dysfunction that's represented in Congress when the places where the people are getting selected from are being focused into narrower and narrower of people that just think the same, so there's no ability for them or no incentive for them to look across the other side to do that, to go back to the fundamental way of how we're grouping the people that are coming together to be the representative nature of what we're trying to get at in the Constitution, and how practically you turn that into effect when the incentives are misaligned.
You know, it's an interesting kind of problem. I mean, there is certainly a way in which, because of a kind of geographic sifting along ideological lines, a lot of congressional districts now are just not as competitive as they used to be. But at the same time, Congress is more competitive than it's been for most of American history. What we've gotten used to in the 21st century, where the control of the House and the Senate are basically up for grabs in every election, is actually really unusual. And we have very narrow majorities. You would think that that would be an incentive to build coalitions. It's not, and it's not for reasons that are definable. There's a wonderful political scientist at Princeton named Francis Lee who has really done, I think, the essential work of helping us understand the incentives that members of Congress face now. And what she shows is that when the majority is narrow and you think you could win control next time, you're in the minority now, but you think next election we're going to win, you have no incentive to bargain with the majority party, because that's just going to make them look good, right? And they have no incentive to bargain with you because they can't give you a win. And so narrow majorities, really tight narrow majorities, create these peculiar incentives that stand in the way of bargaining across party lines. I think that's because we are divided closely, not because we're not. So it's less a function of the kind of sifting that makes individual seats less competitive, and more a function of the very peculiar 50-50 character of American elections in the 21st century. I think this is really the outstanding feature of our politics in this century. We've just had, for example, the third presidential election in a row where control of the White House shifted parties. It's only happened one other time in American history, at the end of the 19th century, which was the only other extended stretch of 50-50 politics. There's a failure of the party system here, and the peculiar thing about it, and this was true then too, is that the parties don't see that they're failing. They're not acting as if what they're doing isn't working. And it isn't. Neither of them can build a durable coalition. But each of them feels like if we just do the same thing again, we're going to win next time. And they're right. right? I mean, Republicans literally just did this. The guy who lost the last election was their candidate again, and he won. And so the message that sends to them is, you're not doing anything wrong, just do it again. Both parties behave this way now, and that does stand in the way of thinking about how could we get to 60% supporting us, or supporting this bill, or supporting our agenda. That failure of a kind of market failure in the party system, I think, is the real puzzle to think through now. And ways out of it, it seems to me, would have to involve some changes in our electoral system, particularly candidate selection. Party primaries are just a very bad fit for American political culture in the 21st century. But they'd have to be changed by the people who got elected through primaries. And how we get there, that's the big question for the likes of me, and I wish I had an answer. I don't.
Excellent question.
I have an online question.
Okay.
So a question we received from someone online was, what are your thoughts on the Constitution still being a living document?
Sure, the Constitution is a living document, but in what sense is it a living document? The Constitution is amendable, and the Constitution also always has to be applied to particular circumstances. But if what we mean by saying it's a living document is that the basic meaning of the words is up to us at any given moment, I just don't think that's how the law works. There are particular words on the page. That kind of living constitution would be an unwritten constitution, right? The British Constitution, a term they use, is basically a function of common law. A lot of it is judge-made, and it evolves over time because it isn't written down. And in that constitution, there are not a lot of formal constraints on the power of the institutions. If you have a majority in Parliament, you can really do pretty much anything in Britain. Our system does not work that way. There are constraints on the powers of the institutions. Those constraints are very frustrating, and the people who are frustrated go to court and say, well, we have a living constitution, so in this moment that means I should be allowed to do this thing that I'm obviously not allowed to do under the Constitution. I don't think judges should listen to that argument. Their job is really to read and apply the words of the Constitution. We can change the words. It's very hard to do. You need a massive supermajority of Americans so that you can get a supermajority in Congress and then in the state legislatures. We've done it 27 times. That's not a lot in 235 years. But it can be done when a lot of Americans want something for a long time. They can change the Constitution. I think we are generally well served by the fact that it's otherwise pretty difficult to change it. We pay a price for it. There's no doubt that we pay a price for the nature of our government. American government is less efficient and less responsive than parliamentary democracies. People are not wrong when they say that. But it is also much more capable of effectively governing a mass, diverse democracy. Political scientists like to compare American government to, like, Norway and Belgium, and they say, well, these are much more responsive and efficient systems. I think the fact that we can even compare our government to Norway's is a testament to the strength of the American Constitution. We are just not like Norway. We are like Brazil, we are like Mexico, we are like India. We're a massive, insanely diverse democracy full of just crazy, wild people doing nutty things all the time. It is very hard to govern this country. And the fact that we can do it well enough that we could even think of comparing ourselves to Belgium is, I think, a testament to the value of the American Constitution. And to think of that as just a living document that ought to be up to whatever we want in the moment, I think, is to lose sight of the most valuable thing about it.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Yuval. Thank you. The book is American Covenant. Thank you for coming and talking about the document that's only a few steps away from us. We hope you'll come back and you have another book I'm sure that you're working on and share that with us as well. And we will continue our series next month in February. David Rubenstein will be here to talk about his book on the presidency, which will be, I think, a tremendous collection of essays and conversations he's had with historians about various presidencies throughout the past couple of years. So please join us for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Really great.
Thanks
Thank
for this. This is great. It's worth it.
Thank you very much for taking my question. The other question I'd like to write back to is, there
go. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
See you tomorrow.
See you.